Astrid Eriksdottir cut peat the way other women spun wool. Slowly, steadily, with a patience that made the people of Grindavik uncomfortable in ways they could not quite explain. She was out on the bog every day from May through September, her iron-bladed turf spade rising and falling in a rhythm as constant as breathing, cutting bricks of dark brown peat from the earth and stacking them in rows to dry. 200 loads. That was what she had told her neighbor Helga she intended to cut. 200 loads of peat, stacked and dried and stored underground before the first frost. Helga had repeated the number to the women at the well, and the women at the well had repeated it to their husbands, and their husbands had repeated it to Jarl Gunnar Oxback at the autumn feast, and the Jarl had laughed so hard he had spilled his mead. 200 loads, he said, wiping his beard. The woman means to heat the entire fjord, or perhaps she plans to build a hill. Either way, she is mad. She has been cutting since May, Torkel reported. Every day, dawn to dusk. She has already stacked more peat than any 3 farms combined. And where is she storing it? Underground. She dug a pit behind her farmhouse, lined it with stones and birch bark, covered it with a turf roof. She says the peat stays dry underground. She says wet peat burns poorly, but dry peat burns hot and slow. Everyone knows that. The problem is not knowing it. The problem is that peat rots underground. It turns to mud. It grows mold. By January, her 200 loads will be 200 loads of black slime, and she will be burning her furniture like every other fool who trusted peat over proper birchwood. The men around the fire nodded. They all burned birchwood, cut from the forests that covered the mountains above Grindavik. Birchwood was reliable. Birchwood was proven. Birchwood was what their fathers had burned and their grandfathers before them. Peat was a fuel of last resort, the fuel of the desperate and the poor, the fuel that smoked and smelled and left a residue on everything it touched. No one in Grindavik stored peat underground. No one in Grindavik cut 200 loads of anything. And no one in Grindavik took seriously the quiet widow on the farm at the edge of the bog, who seemed to believe that she knew something about fuel that 10 generations of Norwegian farmers did not. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today, and if you have not already, subscribe, because what Astrid built under that turf roof is the reason she was the only person in Grindavik with fuel when the ice storm sealed the forest and the birchwood ran out. Astrid's husband, Orm Haraldsson, had died the previous winter. Not of cold, not of illness, but of a falling tree. He had been cutting birchwood in the forest above Grindavik when a dead pine, weakened by rot, toppled without warning and struck him where he stood. He had died instantly, which was the only mercy in a death that had no other. They had been married for 5 years. 5 years of building a farm at the edge of the peat bog that everyone else in Grindavik considered the worst land in the settlement. The bog was too wet to plow, too soft to build on, too far from the forest to make timber hauling practical. Orm had taken it because it was cheap, because he was young and strong, and believed he could make anything work. He had been half right. The farm functioned, barely, producing enough barley and mutton to sustain 2 people. But the firewood problem had plagued them every year. The forest was 4 miles uphill, the terrain steep and treacherous, and hauling 25 cords of birch down the mountain each autumn was work that broke Orm's body a little more each year. "There is fuel under our feet," Astrid had told him every autumn as she watched him limp home from the forest, his back bent under a load of birch. "The bog is peat. Peat burns. It burns slower than wood and hotter than wood, and there is more of it beneath us than we could use in 100 lifetimes." "Peat smells," Orm had replied. "Peat smokes. Peat is the fuel of beggars. Peat kept my grandmother alive for 60 years in Iceland, where there are no trees at all." "We are not in Iceland." They had the same conversation every autumn. And every spring, when the firewood was exhausted and Orm was already dreading the next season's hauling, Astrid would look out at the bog and think about what her grandmother Runa had taught her before the family left Iceland. Runa had been a peat cutter, not casually, not as a supplement to other fuel, but as a master of the craft that had sustained Icelandic life for 500 years. She had taught Astrid the techniques before the girl was old enough to lift the turf spade. How to read the bog for the densest peat. How to cut bricks of uniform size that would dry evenly. How to stack them in patterns that allowed air to circulate through the pile, and most critically, how to store dried peat underground where it would remain bone dry through any weather. "The secret is not the cutting," Runa had said. "Anyone can cut peat. The secret is the drying and the storing. Wet peat is useless. It smokes, it hisses, it gives half the heat it should. Dry peat is gold. It burns clean and slow and hot, and a single brick the size of your head will burn for 2 hours. How do you keep it dry? You put it in the earth. You dig a pit, line it with stones for drainage, cover it with birch bark to keep moisture from seeping through the walls, and roof it with turf that sheds the rain. The air must circulate. You leave gaps in the walls, channels in the floor, a vent in the roof. The air moves through the pit and carries the moisture away. The peat stays dry, always dry." Astrid had carried this knowledge for 20 years, through the move from Iceland to Norway, through her marriage to Orm, through 5 winters of watching him haul birchwood down the mountain while fuel lay beneath her feet. She had never used it because Orm refused, because birchwood was what Norwegians burned, because peat was beneath the dignity of a man who considered himself a proper farmer. Now Orm was dead, and dignity would not keep her warm. She began cutting on May 1st, 3 weeks after the ground thawed enough to work. The peat bog behind her farm was 10 acres of dense, dark fuel, accumulated over thousands of years, compressed by the weight of the earth above, into a material so energy-dense that a single cubic foot contained more heat than twice its volume in birchwood. She cut with a turf spade, a flat iron blade on a long wooden handle, slicing the peat into bricks 12 inches long, 6 inches wide, and 4 inches thick. Each brick weighed 8 pounds wet and would shrink to 3 pounds when fully dried. She cut 40 bricks a day, stacking them in rows on the dry ground beside the bog, turning them every few days so all sides were exposed to the sun and wind. The drying process took 6 weeks. By mid-June, the first bricks she had cut were light and hard, the color of dark chocolate, dry enough that they broke cleanly when snapped and produced no moisture when squeezed. She began cutting new bricks while the first batch dried, creating a continuous cycle of cutting, stacking, drying, and storing that kept her working from dawn to dusk 6 days a week. Stay with me, because what old Runa taught her about storage is the reason Astrid had 200 loads of bone-dry peat when January came, and every farm in Grindavik was watching its birchwood supply dwindle, and the forest was locked behind a wall of ice. The storage pit was the key to everything. Astrid dug it in June, working in the evenings after the day's cutting was done, carving a rectangular chamber into the ground behind her farmhouse. The pit was 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, with walls of packed clay lined with flat stones from the creek bed. She laid a floor of gravel 8 inches deep, creating a drainage layer that would carry any seeping water away from the stored peat and out through a channel that emptied into the bog. On top of the gravel, she laid a platform of split birch poles, raised 4 inches above the gravel on stone supports, creating an air gap beneath the peat that allowed moisture to drain downward and air to circulate upward. The walls were lined with birch bark, overlapping sheets laid like fish scales so water would run down the outside instead of seeping through. She left 4 gaps in the stone lining, 2 near the floor and 2 near the top, creating air channels that allowed a constant, gentle flow of air through the pit. The roof was beams and turf, the same construction as any underground storage chamber. But Astrid added a feature that Runa had taught her was critical for peat storage: a ventilation ridge. Along the peak of the roof, she left a gap 6 inches wide, covered with a wooden cap that could be raised or lowered depending on the weather. On dry days, the cap was raised, allowing moist air to escape from the pit. On wet days, the cap was lowered, sealing the pit against rain. The system worked exactly as Runa had described. Air entered through the 2 lower gaps, passed over the stacked peat, absorbed moisture, rose to the top of the pit, and exited through the upper gaps and the ventilation ridge. The peat lost its remaining moisture over the first month of storage, becoming so dry that it was lighter than cork and hard enough to ring when knocked together. By September, Astrid had cut and stored 200 loads. Each load was approximately 100 bricks, stacked in rows inside the pit, the bricks arranged with gaps between them so air could circulate on all sides. 200 loads, 20,000 bricks, 60,000 pounds of bone-dry fuel. She calculated the heating value. A single dried peat brick burned for 2 hours and produced as much heat as a birch log twice its size. At a rate of 12 bricks per day, she would consume 36 loads over a 6-month winter. She had nearly 6 times what she needed. Enough to heat her farmhouse for 6 years, enough to share. From outside, the storage pit was invisible. The turf roof blended with the meadow. The entrance was a wooden door set into the south wall, concealed by a screen of dead brush. The ventilation ridge looked like a natural crack in the ground. Nothing about it suggested that 60,000 pounds of fuel lay beneath the surface. Jarl Gunnar visited in October, riding past the farm on his way to inspect the forest road. He glanced at the farmhouse, saw no woodpile, and shook his head. "No wood stacked," he told Torkel. "She is burning peat, as she said. But peat stored underground will rot by January. The woman will be cold and crawling to my hall by midwinter." He did not stop. He did not ask. He rode on. The winter arrived in November, cold but not unusual. December was harder, with temperatures dropping to 15 below for a week in the middle of the month. The settlement burned through its birchwood at the expected rate, the fires in the longhouses consuming fuel that had been hauled down the mountain at great expense and effort. Then January came, and with January came the ice. It began as freezing rain on January 3rd, a steady cold drizzle that coated everything it touched in a layer of ice. It fell for 3 days, turning the landscape into a glittering, deadly prison. The trees in the forest were encased in ice so thick that the branches hung to the ground or snapped under the weight. The forest road, steep and treacherous in the best conditions, became a sheet of ice that no horse could climb and no cart could navigate. The birchwood supply of Grindavik was locked behind a wall of ice. The families who had stored 25 cords in October found themselves with 10 cords remaining, with no way to get more from the forest, with 3 months of winter still ahead. By the end of January, panic had set in. Families rationed their wood, burning half of what they needed, huddling in cold longhouses around fires too small to warm the room. Children sickened, old people weakened. The animals in the barns burned through their hay and began to suffer. Gunnar Oxback sent men to the forest 3 times. Each time, they returned with almost nothing. The road was impassable. The trees, when they could be reached, were locked in ice that turned the axes aside. The birchwood that the settlement depended on was as unreachable as if it were on the moon. On February 1st, a delegation came to Astrid's farm, not from the Jarl, but from the families, the mothers and fathers who had watched their fuel supplies dwindle and who remembered the widow at the edge of the bog, the one who cut peat all summer, the one with the underground storage pit. They found her farmhouse warm. The fire in her hearth burned clean and steady, producing a gentle heat and almost no smoke. The fuel in the fire was not birchwood. It was peat, dark brown bricks that glowed red and held their heat for hours. "We need fuel," the leader of the delegation said, a farmer named Halvor, whose 3 children were shivering in a longhouse with an almost empty woodpile. "We have heard you stored peat underground. We have heard you have more than you need." Astrid led them to the storage pit. She pulled open the door and let them look inside. 200 loads of bone-dry peat, stacked in rows that reached to the ceiling, filling the chamber from wall to wall. The peat was light and hard and dry, untouched by the moisture that Gunnar had predicted would destroy it. The birch bark lining had held. The ventilation system had worked. The gravel floor had drained every drop of water. The peat was as dry as the day it had been placed inside, and the chamber held enough fuel to heat every farmhouse in Grindavik for the rest of the winter. "How?" Halvor asked. "The Jarl said it would rot." "The Jarl does not know peat," Astrid said. "My grandmother knew peat. She taught me that peat rots when it is wet and stored without air. Peat thrives when it is dry, and the air circulates. This pit is dry. The air moves through it constantly. The peat is as good today as it was in September. Will you share it?" I cut 200 loads because I knew this would happen, not the ice storm specifically, but something always comes that takes the birchwood away. The forest is far and the bog is here. I will share with every family that needs it. Take 5 loads each. That will see you through March. If Norse reckoning has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Your support helps us bring you more stories of hidden preparation and quiet vindication. They came with sledges and carts and baskets and whatever they could carry. 22 families took peat from Astrid's underground storage over the next week, hauling bricks of dried fuel back to their farmhouses, feeding fires that burned clean and slow and hot, producing warmth that their dwindling birchwood could no longer provide. The peat burned differently than wood. It did not crackle and pop. It glowed, a steady deep red that radiated heat for hours from a single brick. The farmhouses that had been struggling to maintain 40 degrees with rationed birchwood rose to 55 and 60 degrees with peat fires that consumed a fraction of the volume. Gunnar Oxback came on the 3rd day. He stood at the entrance to the storage pit and looked at the rows of stacked peat, at the ventilation system, at the birch bark lining, at the drainage floor, at everything he had said would fail, and that had not failed. "I said it would rot," he said. "It did not rot. I said peat was the fuel of beggars. It is the only fuel you have." A long silence. The wind blew across the bog, carrying the smell of peat smoke from 22 farmhouses that were warm tonight because of bricks cut from the ground by a widow with a turf spade. "Teach me," he said. "My grandmother taught me. I will teach anyone who wants to learn. But first, take 10 loads for your haul. Your fire is nearly out, and the ice will not melt until March." He took the peat. He burned it in his great hall, and when the heat filled the room with steady, even warmth that his last cords of birch could not have matched, he understood what Astrid's grandmother had known, what the Icelandic people had known for 500 years, what every person who had ever dismissed peat as beneath them had failed to understand. The fuel was in the ground. It had always been in the ground. You only had to be willing to dig it up, dry it properly, store it correctly, and burn it without shame. Thank you for watching this story about Astrid Eriksdottir and the 200 loads of peat that saved Grindavik. If it reminded you that the resources you need are sometimes right beneath your feet, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Norse Reckoning for more stories of those who prepared when others dismissed, and provided when others could not. Old Runa had died years before Astrid put her teachings to use, passing in her sleep in the cottage in Iceland, where she had lived for 60 years, burning peat that she had cut from the same bog her mother had cut from, and her grandmother before that. The knowledge had traveled across the sea in a girl's memory, and had saved a settlement that never knew the old woman's name. Astrid taught 15 families to cut and store peat that summer. She supervised the construction of storage pits across Grindavik, each one built to the principles Runa had taught her: stone-lined walls, birch bark waterproofing, gravel drainage, air circulation gaps, ventilation ridge. By the following winter, the settlement's dependence on mountain birchwood had dropped by half. She remarried in the 3rd year, a boat builder named Ketil, who had come to trade timber and had found that the most remarkable woman in the fjord was the one who had made his timber unnecessary for heating. They expanded the farm together, draining sections of the bog for planting, maintaining the peat-cutting operation that supplied fuel not just to their own household, but to neighboring farms. Gunnar Oxback lived another decade, long enough to see peat become the primary fuel of Grindavik, long enough to stop calling it the fuel of beggars, long enough to admit publicly and repeatedly that the widow at the edge of the bog had understood something about survival that 10 generations of Norwegian birchwood burners had missed. The phrase Astrid's bog entered the vocabulary of the western coast, meaning any resource that is dismissed as worthless until someone with the right knowledge makes it essential. When a technique was mocked, when a material was scorned, when a method was called beneath dignity, the old-timers would say, "Remember Astrid's bog. Remember who was warm and who was not." Astrid Eriksdottir lived until the age of 67, dying in the farmhouse that her first husband had built and that her peat had kept warm for 30 winters. They buried her at the edge of the bog, in ground that was soft and dark and rich with the fuel that had saved her and everyone around her. Her gravestone was simple, as she had wanted. The ground gave, she received, she shared. What is the shelter that everyone thinks you do not have? And where have you buried your preparation?